Larry.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us again. This has been such a helpful experience for me. I hope it has been for you. And Peter, you're right. Next week will be our last week. And I have to confess, I'll be sorry to see it come to an end. As you know, we've been exploring the early Christian response to disease. And we discovered that the response of early Christians to the great pandemics of 165, the Antonine Plague, and 251, the early Christian response differed in important ways from that of their contemporaries. We learned that from reading the letters of Cyprian of Carthage and Dionysius of Alexandria. And then we posited that what one believes makes a difference in the way that you respond to disease and suffering. And then we began to trace the emergence of a new belief about disease and healing. We traced it back through Paul and James, all the way back to Jesus himself. And so this evening, we're going to take a further step. In the Gospels, Jesus is represented not only as a healer of physical, that is somatic disease, but also as a liberator from psychological torment. And in our text, especially the Gospel of Mark, this psychological torment is described as spirit possession. Now, I think this topic of psychological healing is especially relevant to this moment in our struggle with the coronavirus pandemic. After 2 months now of self-isolation, it is clear that people's nerves are beginning to fray. Many people are frustrated and angry. Many people are depressed. My wife, the ombudsman, tells me that incidences of domestic violence, violence against women and children, are on the rise. And so I think it's especially appropriate that we're going to look at psychological dimensions of suffering and healing. Now, just let me pause at that moment and invite you all to reflect a little bit on what you're experiencing or what you have observed with friends and neighbors, the way in which disease bores into the human psyche and enhances, sharpens our struggle.
You mentioned the increased violence. That was on the news here yesterday and the day before, that
Yes.
incident of violence and in the home have increased. So there's abuse going on.
Yes, my wife last week co-authored a letter that was jointly written by a committee of all the ombudsmen in the United States, a letter that was sent out to newspapers all around the country, talking about the rise of domestic violence, especially violence against children who are now at home from school. Other comments, questions?
It may not only be domestic, Larry.
We had a sad or an unfortunate incident here in New York just over the past week that got to the papers. There are a lot of us who are, when we do go out, are frustrated by the fact that a number, not a majority, but there are enough people out there not wearing masks outside that are jeopardizing the rest of us. This is a kind of burden on law enforcement as well. And the unfortunate incident was that there was a policeman out of uniform, but he was so outraged by a young man or a group of young men who refused to put masks on when he asked them to, that he started beating at least one of them up. And he was a cop. He was obviously in much better physical shape, knew much better how to fight and defend himself, and did some damage to the young man in question. So the pressure is within the four walls, especially if there are some tensions within those four walls before all of this even started. And I think it's, we are all celebrating our heroes, rightly, just legitimately so, certainly including police officers. And I'm, it's just a reminder that the pressure on them is just enormous. And I wouldn't begin to condone beating up the guy, but I do understand the frustration and the rage that kind of gets pent up.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, I've seen that story. It's been on the news here, and I've also seen stories from Texas and Michigan where protesters have actually attacked the police. Yeah, so we're struggling with this. And I will admit that because I'm such a social creature, I love my interaction with students and with church people. Yeah, I've found myself liable to sadness. And I wouldn't go all the way to call it depression, but it's a struggle. Well, let's take another step into the text, or at least the framework, the context, in which I would invite us to read two stories from the Gospel of Mark. Stories in which Jesus casts out demons that are described as unclean spirits. Now, you may be wondering whether it is not anachronistic for me to speak of spirit possession in psychological terms. And if that's what you're wondering, I would like to recommend a book by a young scholar at Harvard Divinity School. Among other duties, I have the privilege of editing a book series for Yale University Press called Syncresis. And a new volume, brand new, in that series is by Giovanni Bazzana, an Italian-born and educated scholar of early Christianity who teaches now at Harvard. Listen to the title of his book, Having the Spirit of Christ, and the subtitle, Spirit Possession and Exorcism in Early Christ Groups, just published in January 2020 by Yale University Press. And if you peruse this book, what you will discover, it turns out that ancient text, I'm talking about text from the time of Jesus himself, already recognize that spirit possession is a psychological illness. Let me give a few examples. Has anyone here heard of Lucian of Samosata, a gifted writer who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era? he wrote a dialogue called the Philipsoides, in which he describes a Syrian exorcist who, quote, frees possessed people from their terrors by exorcising the spirits. He restores them to health, and now listen to this, and sends the spirits away, restoring them to a normal mind. You see the connection there between spirit possession and psychological struggle. Lucian adds, by the way, delivering them from their difficulties for a large fee. Plutarch, you've probably heard of Plutarch, Platonist, priest at Delphi at the end of the first century. In one of his lives, he tells the story of Nicias, whom he describes as possessed, daimonon, and crazy, paraphronon. In the story that Plutarch tells, he tore off his mantle, rent his tunic, and leapt up out of his seat half naked and ran toward the exit of the theater. Finally, my final example is one with which I think you will already be familiar. Do you remember in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, the story of the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac? After Jesus frees this tortured man from the legion, you remember, of unclean spirits that are possessing him, take a look at Mark chapter 5, verse 15. He is described as, quote, clothed and in his right mind, sophronunta. Well, once it is recognized that spirit possession was understood, even in the ancient world, to be a psychological illness, then we are able to make an illuminating cross-cultural comparison, I believe. In Greek and Roman writers, especially writers who came from the upper class, the educated elite, psychological illness was conceived as a disorder of the elements that make up the soul or the psyche. There are a number of Greek terms for psychological disorder. Athumia, which means depression. Mania, madness. Aponoia, desperation. Paranoia, derangement. But all of these psychological sufferings and illnesses were understood by educated, upper class Greek and Roman writers to result from a disorder of the elements within the soul caused by pain, grief, or loss. And therefore, the therapy that was offered was not exorcism, but cognitive psychagogy. The Greek term psychagogy means the leading or the guidance of souls. And the therapist was not the doctor, but, can you guess? The philosopher. It was the great French historian of the Greek and Roman world, Pierre Hadot. You may know him because he was a great influence upon Michel Foucault. And it was Pierre Hadot who realized that in antiquity, the philosopher, not the doctor, was called in when someone began to exhibit psychological illness. Let me give a couple of examples. There is a pseudo-Platonic dialogue called Axiochus, which was actually written in the 1st century, scholars believe. And in this dialogue, a man named Axiochus has had a disease, a physical disease that led him to the point of death. He's had a close brush with death. And after he got well, he becomes madly depressed. And he locks himself up in his house in Athens. And so, can you guess what his friends do? They go and get Socrates. And they say, Socrates, please come and administer the medicine of philosophical consolation to Axiochus. So a cognitive therapy. Here's my second example. You've all heard of Cicero, the great Roman lawyer and politician. Did you know that Cicero temporarily retired from public life? He withdrew to his villa following the death of his beloved daughter, Tullia, who died in childbirth. And so he went to his villa in Tusculum and he wrote in 4 books a disputation with his own soul. That work survives. You can read it today. It's called the Tusculum Disputations. And there you see Cicero, the Stoic / Platonic philosopher, applying a cognitive therapy to his own depression, almost suicidal depression, as Cicero tells us, and trying to convince himself that the pain that he is experiencing can be overcome if he can convince himself that his true inner self has not been touched by the loss of his daughter. Now, so far in my cross-cultural comparison, I've been describing how psychological illness was conceived and how therapy for it was developed by upper-class, educated Greeks and Romans. But among the subaltern populations, that is to say, among the lower classes of the Greek and Roman world, especially in the East, in Syria, in Palestine, in Egypt, psychological suffering was understood to be the result not of a disordered soul, but the result of invasion by a spirit. And that's what we see in the Gospels, right? That reflect Palestinian traditions. And what we encounter here is the vulnerability of the oppressed. That vulnerability is the underlying social reality of psychological suffering. I had my own experience of this when back in 1992, I took a group of 17 seminary students to the north of Brazil. And we spent 3 weeks traveling through the cities of the north, Recife, Salvador. We wound up in Rio. And in Rio, we visited what was that time church in the world. It's called the Universal Kingdom of God Church. more than 100,000 members. They had worship services 24 hours a day, every hour. The church was packed with the poor from the favelas, from the ghettos of Rio. Can you guess what they specialized in that church? Demon exorcism. It was shocking and frightening. My students and I were sitting in the church, singing and praying along with the other worshipers, and all of a sudden, a few seats away from us, a man stood up and began to cry out. And the ministers who had been standing all along the walls of the church, they rushed to this demon-possessed man and began the exorcism. And over the next hour, one person after another stood up and cried out. And from a sociological point of view, I think what was happening there was very comprehensible. The poor of Brazil, at least in those days, I haven't been back there since 1992, they were horribly neglected. The message that was being sent to them by their society was that your life is worth less than a cigarette butt on the street. And so when you internalize that kind of negative self-image, that your life is worth nothing, among the lower classes, this is experienced as possession by a spirit. So let me pause just at this point, having completed my little cross-cultural comparison, and let me see what thoughts or comments you have. And after that, with all of that background in mind, we will turn to two passages in the Gospel of Mark. So tell me your thoughts, your comments.
I have a comment. What you just brought to mind for me is how the affluent out in California in the 1960s engaged in a kind of exorcism called primal scream. Does anyone remember that? And I think that contemporary society have sectioned off psychotherapy from faith and religion, so it is a science and experience of its own. But what you've just described is what I think that primal scream and some of the personal therapies were happening in the 60s here, and not just among the poor, but among people who can afford to spend their time and their money out in Big Sur screaming.
Thank you. That is very interesting. Thank you for that observation. Are there other comments, questions?
I may want to say somewhere along the line, Larry, you've kind of alluded to it. Cognitive therapy as a word you use to describe the philosopher
Yes.
eating. And the person just before me spoke about contemporary therapy, psychological therapies, having become somewhat divorced from Christianity, from religion generally. But there is such a thing as Christians who are psychotherapists, who are very much in the behavioral game. And I'd just be curious, this is more a general question about what you specifically just said, about your own sense of the role of religion in contemporary therapy, that is psychological therapy.
Yes. Unfortunately, I don't know as much about that as I wish I did. I'll just share two experiences. When I arrived at Yale Divinity School in the fall of 1977, Peter, such a long time ago, my grandfather had just died, and he was the dearest person in the world to me at that time. And I was in grief. I was really in grief, bordering on depression. And I didn't have $150 an hour to go see a psychotherapist. That was the going rate in those days. I don't know what it is now. So I was sharing my struggle with my professor in early Christian history, Rowan Greer, a patristic scholar. And he said to me, Larry, if you will come to my office every Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, you and I will translate the text, the messages that are written on ancient Greek and Roman tombstones that reflect how people were dealing with loss and death and grief in the time of Jesus and Paul. And can you believe it? He gave me course credit for doing that. I still have a collection, a large collection of tombstone translations. And he offered me a kind of Christian therapy for my grief. When I was finally able to afford, after I had a job in Chicago, to afford a psychoanalyst, a very good one, with whom I worked for about a year, I don't know what his religious background was, because he was such a strict Freudian that he said nothing in our sessions. He just let me talk and occasionally ask a question. And at the end of a year, when he dismissed me, he made the only substantive comment that he had made in a whole year. He said, Mr. Welborn, I believe this has been good for you. So I can't, those two little stories are the only thing I have to share, but others in our group may know more. The point of my cross-cultural comparison was to say that in the Gospels, we are dealing with down and out people, poor Palestinians who conceptualize their psychological suffering not as a disorder within the hierarchy of the soul, but rather as invasion by a spirit. And that's the context, right, for understanding these gospel stories. Are there any more comments or questions before we...
Just a word to out myself. For the first 7 years of my part of my career, I was a mental hospital chaplain. And I spent a lot of my career in relationship of religion and psychiatry. And even to the present time, I'm part of a discussion group with members of the Columbia Psychoanalytic Institute. So I've spent a lot of my career doing this. So it goes on, and they're very important things that are still being discovered out of this. But more related to this topic, there's a great deal of interest now in public health areas about native healers in all cultures, and what they bring to bear in terms of sort of mental health treatment. And it's much less something that was something that used to be sort of dismissed or dispensed with, but it's much more taken seriously. And I've known individuals of a very Western professional background who've cooperated with native healers. And so that there's been an interesting confluence or marriage at certain places and among certain people in the kind of dynamic that you described in the ancient world. It's not that, to me at least, it doesn't sound strange or odd or out of place at all. It's culturally specific to that time and place of the human condition and the need for getting better.
Yes. Thank you. That's a very helpful comment. If you have the interest in reading the book that I recommended by Giovanni Bazzana, he begins the book by telling a fascinating story of a case of spirit possession that happened on the last occasion when the Shroud of Turin was presented to the public in northern Italy. And a woman came and stood before the shroud for a few minutes and then collapsed on the floor. Her body contorted. She spoke in a foreign language that no one understood. And after a few minutes, she got up and left. Well, of course, this was a sensation that was reported in the newspapers in northern Italy. And a psychologist commented and said, no, she probably wasn't possessed by a spirit. She must have been suffering from some sort of psychological condition. And an exorcist, an authorized priest who engaged in exorcism, also wrote in to the newspaper, and he said, no, it couldn't have been real spirit possession because she didn't utter any blasphemies against the Lord, and she didn't try to do physical violence to the shroud. Well, can you guess how this story ends? The very next day, the woman herself, a poor little woman from the Italian countryside, wrote into the newspaper and said, oh, yes, it was spirit possession. You can deny it all you want, but I was possessed by a spirit. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that psychological struggle, psychological suffering is conceptualized in different ways, in different cultures. And that's the context for understanding and appreciating the stories in Mark's gospel. All right, let's take a step now. With all of that background in mind, let's look at the first story. The first story is found in Mark chapter 1, verses 23 to 28. Jesus is in Capernaum in Lower Galilee, and he's in a synagogue. And my translation of verse 23 goes like this. And immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. The Greek says anthropos in pneumati akatharto. Now, unclean spirit is a Jewish formulation. How do we know? Because it has parallels in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it probably reflects the story of the origin of such spirits as a result of illicit intercourse between the fallen angels and mortal women. That story is found in 1st Enoch. It is repeated in the book of Jubilees. In fact, there are even allusions to it in one of the New Testament writings. The angels who left their place in heaven and came down to earth and had illicit intercourse with mortal women, and the result was spirits of impurity that roamed the earth. Now look at verse 24. Here's my translation. And he cried out. The Greek verb is anakroxo. And if we were all together in person at St. Bart's, I would invite you to say that word with me, anakroxo. It's an onomatopoetic word, one of those words that sounds like what it is. You can hear that. Anakroxo, a cry burst out of this man, saying, what is there between us and you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come here to destroy us? I know you, who you are, the Holy One of God. Now, what I want to point out here is that the spirit addresses Jesus first. As far as I know, this is unique in ancient literature about spirit possession and exorcism. I spoke a few minutes ago about Lucian's Syrian exorcist, and in Lucian's case, the exorcist addresses the spirit first. In a first century writing called the Testament of Solomon, Solomon, who is a great exorcist, speaks first, asking the demon, "Who are you? What is your name?" But I think more important than who speaks first, the crucial thing here in Mark's gospel is that the sufferer recognizes Jesus. He knows somehow who Jesus is. Now, how can this be? And can it be explained? There is a wonderful New Testament scholar, a Canadian, who, after a long career as a psychologist, retrained himself as a New Testament scholar, got a PhD in New Testament. His name is John Miller. And for many years, he was the chair of the Historical Jesus Seminar at the Society of Biblical Literature. And he wrote a little book, which I would strongly recommend. It's published by HarperCollins. John Miller, the book is called Jesus at 30. And it is a psychological interpretation of the work of Jesus. It is not at all goofy. It is exegetically well-grounded. And what John Miller argues is that psychological sufferers, people who believe themselves to be possessed by spirits, were drawn to Jesus because they saw in him the resolution of the inner conflicts from which they themselves suffered. I think it's a plausible hypothesis, at least the most plausible that I have encountered. And it resonates with a few of my own experiences. Some years ago, I became involved when I was teaching in Chicago. I became involved in some faith-based social action. One of my students, who was a pastor of a local church, the two of us encouraged members of a large church on the west side of Chicago to go into the projects, into Cabrini Green, and to paint the apartments there and to fix them up. And believe it or not, we were opposed. We got ourselves into political trouble. So my student suggested that we needed advice, and he recommended that we make a kind of pilgrimage to Denver to talk with a wonderful man named Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding was one of Martin Luther King's advisors, a young man who participated in the civil rights struggle. He got his PhD at the University of Chicago. He was the first director of the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. And eventually, he left Atlanta and became the professor of religion and social change at Iliff Seminary and the University of Denver. So we called him up and we said, "We're in trouble. We need advice." We got on a plane and flew to Denver. And in those days, before 9/11, you could, of course, walk all the way down to the gate in order to pick up someone who was arriving. on an inbound flight. So we had never seen Vincent Harding before. We didn't know what he looked like. I have to tell you that Vincent Harding was an African American Quaker. There aren't very many of those. And he was a profound spirit. He was at peace with himself. He was comfortable with silence and with listening. He was a great listener. Anyway, when my colleague and I got off of the airplane and started looking around for Vincent Harding, there came toward us, walking down through the airport, a man whose posture and demeanor, whose carriage of his body communicated an inner peace, that he was comfortable with himself and with others, that he had resolved within himself the very kinds of anxieties that my friend and I were troubled by. And right away we knew that he was the man we were looking for. And so we went to his home and spent a week in the home of Vincent and Rosemary Harding. Well, let me stop just at this point for a minute and see if there are comments or questions about what we've learned so far about this story.
Just as an aside, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yeah, I lived in Chicago and I was active in Fourth Presbyterian Church. And one of the things I did is I went into Cabrini Green, with the small groups and painted the apartments and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you expanded the thing, but yeah.
Oh, that's really wonderful. My wife was an elder at Fourth Presbyterian Church. And
You're kidding.
And no, I'm not kidding. This is probably, I'm much older than you are, but this is back in the days when John Buchanan.
Yeah, I was a deacon there.
Yeah, the great John Buchanan wasn't he an amazing preacher?
Yeah, amazing.
And the work that Fourth Church did in Cabrini Green, it was just inspiring. And so my friend Frank Thomas, that's the person I was talking about. Now he is the professor of homiletics at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. But in those days, he was a church pastor on the west side of Chicago. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great connection. Are there other comments, questions? So let's move further into the story. Verse 25. And Jesus rebuked the spirit, saying, "Be muzzled," or "be silenced." The Greek verb is phimotheti, and come out of him. The Greek magical papyri have a number of binding spells that are called phimotheka, muzzling or binding spells. And so Jesus binds the spirit that is possessing this man. Verse 26, and the unclean spirit convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice and went out of him. Verse 27, and all were amazed and inquired of each other, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Now, a couple of points that I want to make about this story. First of all, notice that Jesus does not, like a philosopher, attempt to apply cognitive therapy and to persuade this man that his soul is disordered. No, he takes the psychological suffering as he finds it. He works within this man's assumption that he is possessed by an unclean spirit. And Jesus exorcises by a command, a word of command. Now, this procedure contrasts with the account of an exorcism that is found in the Jewish historian Josephus in the 8th book of his Antiquities. Josephus says that a certain Eleazar, a Jewish exorcist, in the presence of the future emperor Vespasian and his sons and the number of the soldiers, freed persons who were possessed by demons, and this was the manner of the cure. He put to the nose of the possessed person a ring which had under its seal one of the herbal roots prescribed by Solomon. And then, as the man smelled it, he drew out the demon through his nostrils. Then, wishing to convince the bystanders and to prove to them that he had this power, Eleazar placed a foot basin full of water a little way off, and he commanded the demon as it went out of the man to overturn it and to make known to the spectators that he had left the man. Well, you can see for yourself the striking difference between Jesus' approach to the person possessed with a spirit. He speaks a word of command. In a more general sense, I would observe that the lesson for us today is that Jesus took psychological suffering seriously. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't retreat from it. He didn't leave the man to his own suffering. And as a society today, I'm afraid it is my impression that we are not responding with any kind of wisdom or with the proper empathy, with the resources to the needs of those who are suffering psychologically. Right here in Southwest Ohio, in August of this past year, a teenager, a young man who had been suffering psychologically. His parents knew that he was suffering. His friends knew. His neighbors knew. But no one did anything about it. There were no services available. And so, as you probably know, on a Friday night in August, he took an automatic rifle into the entertainment district of Dayton, Ohio, and in 9 seconds, he killed 9 people and wounded 17 others. And among the dead was his own sister. We could all probably tell stories like this. Psychological suffering is not, in my opinion, receiving the kind of resources economically and politically. It doesn't get the attention that it needs. And I think the lesson of Mark's portrayal of Jesus is that Jesus responds directly, responds with empathy to the person who is suffering from psychological illness. Let me pause here again for a moment and invite your comments and questions.
So I have a question. I wonder if you could tell us a little more about what the ancient understanding was of unclean. You know, we're in this pandemic, we're all washing our hands, we're obsessed with things that we can't see, but that,
Yes.
you know, can hurt us.
Right.
Was an unclean spirit contagious? Because sometimes you hear about they come out of the person and then have to go into some other animal or something.
Exactly.
So was there an idea that that other people in proximity to them could also be affected, and how did this relate to particularly to Jewish ideas about purity? And
thank you. That is such a good question. First of all, it is clear from the ancient texts, both Jewish and Christian, that ancients did not believe that spirit possession could be cured. The spirit could only be transferred. It could only be sent out into another person or into an animal or into water. In the next text from the Gospel of Mark that we're going to look at, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, when Jesus commands the spirits to go out of the Gerasene demoniac, the legion of spirits plead with Jesus. They say, don't just send us out into the wilderness. Let us go where?
into a herd of swine?
Into the pigs, that's right. Into the herd of swine. And this reflects the ancient belief that spirit possession could not be cured. It could only be transferred. Now, let me address your, I think, more important question. How was impurity contracted? And how was it understood? And we know a lot about this from Jewish sources. There were many sources of impurity, but the one that, the source that was most closely associated with unclean spirits, with spirit possession, was corpse impurity. And you may recall that the Gerasene demoniac in Mark chapter 5, where is he living in the text? When he comes rushing up to Jesus, he comes from where?
I don't remember.
Out of the tombs. He had been living, he had been sleeping in the graveyard, in the tombs. And one of the assumptions, clear assumption of the text, is that he had contracted corpse impurity because he's been sleeping on the graves of the dead. The kind of dead person whose spirit was most contagious is referred to in ancient text as a nekudaimon. Do you know what that means? It's the spirit of someone who died violently. So someone who was murdered or someone who died in a violent accident. The spirits of those people were especially contagious. And ancient magicians, I referred earlier to a first century magical text called the Greek magical Papyri. When a magician wanted to get a spirit under his control to do something, he uttered a spell to summon a nekudaimon, the spirit of someone who had died violently. Those were the spirits that were most easy to summon and to manipulate. And they were the source of impurity. There are lots of texts that I could cite, but there is a text in Luke's gospel that's very interesting. Jesus has been criticized by the Pharisees for eating and drinking with impure people, namely tax collectors and prostitutes. And Jesus responds rather sharply to his Pharisaic critic by comparing the Pharisee to unmarked graves. So if a grave is unmarked, then what? People can walk over it without recognizing that they are what? Contracting an impure spirit, an unclean spirit, corpse impurity. The Pharisee and the scribe who heard Jesus compare them to unmarked graves, they were furious, as you might expect. And so Jesus got up and left the dinner table quickly. But that's a very good question that you've asked. And I think, fortunately, that's a question that the sources allow us to answer. Are there other comments, questions?
I have a question or a comment. In the late 1980s, I served as pastor of a church in Northeast Ohio, where in the 9 months before I arrived at that church, a 12-year-old boy was murdered, and a 16-year-old boy who was also a member of the church was convicted of the murder, and a 16-year-old girl committed suicide, member of the church, and a 15-year-old member of the church attempted suicide, all in this 9-month period before I arrived. I only stayed there 22 months. I was kind of an unintentional interim. It was the most dysfunctional congregation I ever served. And yet when I left, it became apparently very functional. My successor stayed for like 16 years afterwards.
You did something right.
So I did a good job, I guess. But if I'm a rational, modern person, but I have to say there was something wrong there, and I can't. I mean, this language works better for me than all the other languages about unclean spirits and whatever. There was something terrible that was going on in the soul of that community, and I still puzzle over it. And I read Mark and I say, yeah, this sounds like that.
Right. Thank you very much for that comment, because what you are leading us to think about is that even though the stories of exorcism focus on suffering individuals, in fact, communities suffer psychologically. Communities exhibit behaviors that we could describe as possession by an evil spirit. And I hate to tell you, I think that's where we are as a nation today, in many ways. Well, let me turn then very briefly, because I see our time is flying away, to the other text for tonight, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20. They went to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. Gerasa, by the way, was a large Hellenistic city. The ruins of it today are still beautiful. It had a mixed population, Jews and Gentiles. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit encountered him, who made his dwelling among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was constantly howling and cutting himself with stones. Probably in all of ancient literature, there is no more perfect graphic description of a self-destructive individual. There is a story by an ancient author named Phlegon. He composed a text called the Book of Marvels. And he tells about a young man who was visited, who was possessed by a Neku-daimon, the spirit of someone who died violently. And he became so depressed and self-destructive, he suffered from depression, athumia. And can you guess the outcome? He committed suicide. And this poor man here who comes out to Jesus is pretty close, isn't he, to suicide, cutting himself, mutilating himself. Chapter 5, verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, even from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. And he cried out in a loud voice and said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." Now, 2 points I want to make here. Once again, the demon recognizes Jesus. He recognizes who he is. He comes running to him from a distance, this poor suffering man. And once again, I have to admit, I am attracted to the explanation offered by John Miller in his book, Jesus at 30. Miller argues that what drew people to Jesus, what they saw in him, what they recognized, was a person who had resolved the inner conflicts from which they themselves suffered. Now, notice in this case that the spirit-possessed man tries to bind Jesus preemptively. The Greek verb that is translated, I adjure you, horkitzo. Can you say that with me? Horkitzo. That is the technical word for binding a demon. It literally means to bind with an oath. So the idea was that the exorcist would take an oath by God, and by means of that oath, bind the demon. And the spirit-possessed person, that is, the demon within him, tries to preemptively bind Jesus. Look at chapter 5, verse 8. For he was saying to him, Jesus was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" Now, this is the turning point in the encounter between the suffering man and Jesus. It is the discovery of the Spirit's identity, the name. And as you can see in the text, the Spirit-possessed person replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Now, legion, of course, is not a Greek word. It's not an Aramaic word. It's what kind of word? Latin. It is the technical Latin name of a Roman military unit. In the time of Jesus, a legion consisted of 5,400 men. And the legion that was stationed in Palestine, it had been organized by Augustus, and it was stationed in Palestine beginning in 14 AD. Eventually, this legion fought in the Jewish war. Some of you may know it was Legion number 10, Phratensis. Now, every legion had a banner that was carried before the legion when they were on the march. Can anyone guess what was the symbol represented on the legionary banner of Legion number 10 Phratensis? Does anyone know? It was the wild boar, a wild pig. Keep that in mind as we move on into the story. But already I think it is clear that the political implications of the name of the Spirit that possesses the man are clear in this story. Palestine in the time of Jesus was occupied by the Roman legions. And this man has internalized that occupation. The name of the Spirit that possesses him is Legion. In other words, the demonic here has a political aspect. And by the way, that's recognized by psychologists today. The British Medical Bulletin has an interesting article entitled "Tyranny and Mental Health." A Harvard psychologist, Elizabeth Nugent, wrote an interesting essay that I read called "The Psychology of Repression and Polarization in Authoritarian Regimes." In fact, the great Nelson Mandela confessed that his mind played tricks on him during all those years when he was incarcerated on Robben Island by the apartheid regime. And one of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's most moving, heartbreaking poems is a poem that he wrote when he was imprisoned by Hitler. Maybe you've read that poem. It was written in Tegel prison. It's called "Who Am I?" And you can see Bonhoeffer there struggling with his identity under an authoritarian regime. Well, now to complete the story, chapter 5, verse 10, he begged Jesus earnestly not to send them, that is the spirits, out of the country. Now, there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine. Let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Once again, you see the political implications that I think are clear in this text. Where did the occupied Jews of Palestine want to send the Roman legions? They wanted to send them over the cliff into the sea. Now, finally, look at the response of the people of Gerasa and the surrounding countryside. Chapter 5, verse 14. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus, and they saw the demoniac sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion. And they were afraid. Then those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and the swine reported it. Now, tell me what you think. Wouldn't you expect that the neighbors of this poor, suffering, self-destructive man would be thrilled, that they would rejoice to see the poor sufferer sitting there beside Jesus, clothed and in his right mind? But that is not how they respond. Why not? Because the swine, which were evidently a communal herd, that is a kind of stock market in which people had invested. So the stock market in Gerasa has just what? Crashed, like our stock market did at the outbreak of the coronavirus. And so look at chapter 5, verse 17. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by the demons begged him that he might go with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy the Lord has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. One of the deep points of wisdom in this story is the economic cost, which is absolutely clear, of rescuing people who suffer from psychological conditions. Many of you in our class can remember when the hospitals for psychological sufferers were closed because conservative state legislatures didn't want to spend the money on it. And so people were pushed out into residential homes in the neighborhoods. And in many cases, they were just abandoned on the streets. And our inner cities became like the temples in the Greek and Roman world, where sufferers were dumped on the streets of big cities like Chicago and New York. This story is so profound because it illustrates that there is not only a political dimension to psychological suffering, but there is an economic cost to society in order to deal with the problem. And sadly, that's a cost which it seems our society at this moment is not willing to pay. Well, let me stop at this point and see if there are final comments, observations, questions, and then at the end of class in a few minutes, I'm going to make sure that everyone has my email so that we can continue this discussion after the class is over.
Let me say something about looking at this a somewhat different way, because as you were going through, Mark, and as we were talking about all these different things, the Gospels, of course, were written all those years ago by people who did not have all the background that we have today, all of the psychological and physical and evolving knowledge of science and so on. And I wonder if we can't look at this in a different way, in that I think that anybody who murders has something in his mind that's driving him to do this, or anybody who kills himself, or anybody who does anything. It's because he has it in his own mind, and not necessarily a demon. See, they believed in demons. I think today we would say that people get their ideas from something maybe they see on television, or they see in the movies, and we have this all the time today. That man in Dayton, I think you said.
Yes,
I remember hearing about that on television when it happened. I think it happened not long after another mass murder.
It was the one in Texas.
And this goes on, and this gets in people's minds. And instead of getting help, they act out of their own volition because of what they were hearing and what they've heard. And which is a somewhat different way of looking at this, because I don't believe in demons per se. I think the demons come from all the stuff that we hear and read and see.
Thank you. That's a very helpful comment, and it makes a lot of sense to me. And the bottom line here, I think, is that if we are searching for the reason why the early Christian response to disease was different from their neighbors, I think we are very close to finding an answer now. It's because Jesus himself reached out to people who were suffering. And I think that's the task of the church today. And I know that St. Bart's has been for many of us a place of healing. And I think churches ought to be more front and center in their advocacy for responses to an engagement of resources in mental health. Now, Peter, you can tell, once again, it's happened. I've stopped teaching and started preaching.
But I could add to what you just said, though, about St. Bart's. A lot of people come to the church for help.
Yes.
I think that's a very good way of taking part in what's bothering you, is go to a church and get some help rather than not getting help.
Exactly. Exactly.
Larry, something more mundane. It would be helpful, excuse me, if you with Peter could circulate at the end of the course a reading list, all references. Peter has done that somewhat as we've been going along through the chat box. But maybe session by session, you have cited a number of things, a number of contemporary theological scholarly references, especially that I'd be interested in seeing. I think others might as well. Perhaps it can be done on our website. but just a way to follow up and keep reading just this wonderful world of scholarship that you are opening up to us. I remember last week, especially, and I don't think Peter referenced this. You were talking about the scholar who had looked at Mark's gospel and saw the two parallel strains.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes. That's Paul Ochtemeyer.
Yes.
Yes, it was a brilliant piece of literary archaeology. He's convinced just about everybody that embedded in Mark's gospel are two primitive collections of stories of Jesus healing and stories of exorcism. And I mean, that's really a precious discovery because I mean, these are the earliest Christian sources that we have. And look how Jesus is portrayed, right? He's portrayed as a person who made himself available to the suffering and the sick.
Great. I more grist for my mill, but something of a bibliography, a reference, session by session, to some of the major works that you have cited, I think would be helpful to all of us. And
good, I will. That's very helpful.
I'll work with Larry on that.
Thank you. I will do that, and Peter will help me with it.
I have a question, and that is, you know, very often when people came to Jesus for healing, he would ask them, "What is it I can do for you?"
Yes.
When people who are possessed by demons, is that same question asked? I don't see that happening, and if not, why is there a difference there?
Oh, that's very interesting, isn't it? What's striking in all of these stories is that it is the sufferer, the spirit-possessed person, who speaks first. Mm-hmm. And the question that they ask in Greek, if you translate it literally, the question is, what is there between us and you, Jesus? It's an attempt to sort out the relationship in advance. It's that kind of psychological ambivalence that all of us feel. I don't know about you, but if you have ever been wounded in a situation or by a person, and that wound, that deep wound has gone into the bottom of your soul, and to some degree or another you have shaped, or I have shaped, my identity around that wound, at the same time that I would like to be free of that, there's a part of me that is reluctant to give it up. And to acknowledge that I've been hurt openly and that I am wounded. It's safer to keep it hidden away, to continue to nurse it. And I think it's that sort of psychological ambivalence that comes to expression in these stories. I pointed out earlier that in all of the other accounts of exorcism from antiquity, it is the exorcist who speaks first. It's only in the stories about Jesus that the suffering person begins the dialogue. I'm going to be, and I want to thank you for your question, because you've given me even a greater impetus to think more about that this week and to see if I can understand it.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to say that I never heard or put together the request or the demand that Jesus leave with the economic suffering that he had just inflicted on the community. And in the following verse, when the man who's been cured wants to get into the boat with Jesus,
Yes.
and it says to be with him, I thought it was because sort of out of gratitude or he felt protected. But in fact, he may have been afraid because he has to stay in the community. Someone's going to get blamed for that loss, and Jesus is out of town.
Yes.
So there's a further depth there that's quite poignant given what we're going through at the moment.
Absolutely. Just before our Zoom meeting began, the breaking story here in Ohio is that conservative members of the Ohio legislature have drafted a law that will diminish the authority of our chief medical officer, Amy Acton, because her insistence upon staying at home and isolating until we get control of this disease, that's frustrating the economic interests here in this state. And so now they're going to take action against her. And so I'm so glad that you picked up on that economic aspect. Yeah, there's a political and an economic dimension here. Now, I see our time is gone, but can I invite you to be thinking a little bit toward the topic of our final class session together? In the end, I have become convinced that it was the early Christian attitude toward death and resurrection that made all the difference. So we're going to focus next week on texts that show Jesus confronting death. We're going to look at a text in Mark's gospel where Jesus is called to the home of a public official whose little daughter is at the point of death and who actually dies, and how Jesus reacts to it. We're going to look at the text where Jesus is told that his friend Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha in Bethany, Jesus is told that Lazarus is dying. And we're going to look carefully at how Jesus responds to death. And I guess, Peter, as I've thought about this whole topic, I've had a breakthrough. I feel like it came in the middle of the night last night. I was thinking ahead to next week, and I finally understood that, well, let's say we find a vaccine for coronavirus and it goes away. And let's say that none of us who are part of this Zoom meeting die of coronavirus. Nevertheless, we will die someday, whether it's from cancer or heart disease or stroke or old age. And so as I thought about that, finally I began wondering, how did Jesus respond to death? And yeah, that's where we're going next week. I hope that brings you back for next week. Thank you so much for tonight.
Were you going to have your email posted?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for reminding me. I got so involved in thinking about how Jesus responded to death. My email is very simple. It is Welborn, Welborn, at Fordham, FORDHAM.edu. And I see that Peter has put it up on the chat.
Yeah, it was incorrect. I added an extra L at the beginning, so it's just.
Well, did you know that in 1610, when the first Welborn arrived in Virginia, there were 2 L's, but one got dropped as time passed.
Because you were well born.
Yes, that's it.
It's an old English name.
Yeah, born by the well.
The Fordham is not capitalized. It's small.
No, it's not. Right. It's just all lowercase letters. Welborn at fordham.edu. Thank you for this tonight.
Yeah, and if I can just add a quick plug, we've begun something called night prayer at 8:30 every night, Monday through Friday. So if you'd like to join us, I'll put the link in the chat for that too. It's also, now I checked yesterday, it's on the website. So if you'd like to join us for night prayer tonight at 8:30, feel free to join us. The other thing is Sunday for the forum at 10 o'clock on Sunday on our Facebook and our YouTube. We're going to have Kurt Hart, who's been on this call, priest in the diocese, editor of Journal of Health and Religion, ethicist. So please join us if you have a chance for the forum on Sunday. Great. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you all so much. See you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
So